Welcome. I'm Michael McLendon, and it's really a great pleasure to be able to welcome you here today to this study break faculty lecture, and it's a great pleasure for me to be with you at a moment of real celebration. I know for many of you, raise your hand if you would, if you have a child that's graduating this weekend. Almost all of you. And I have no idea why the others of you who don't are here, but I'm pleased to see you nonetheless. I met several of you as you walked in. Mr. Tierney, whose son Sean will be in one of our very own programs this next year, and my friend Steve Smart over here, who works with Vanderbilt and has for many years. I wonder if we can go around just very quickly. This will actually help me as I think about some of my remarks today. And maybe just say where you are from. Where are you from?
I'm from Tallahassee, Florida. My name is Madeline Steen.
Terrific.
My son's in Arts and Sciences.
And graduating. Terrific.
She's my daughter. High school student.
Great to have you. Hope you're here in a year or two.
Right here in Nashville and across the quad from you at Peabody.
Terrific.
I've lived in Tallahassee, Florida, and Atlanta, Georgia, and Nashville.
And this is Steve. Yes.
I'm in Nashville now, and I'm a prosecutor in the law school.
Terrific.
Philadelphia.
Washington, D.C.
Connecticut.
Greenwich?
Colorado Springs.
I work here at Vanderbilt. I'm the editor of the Vanderbilt.
Yes, of course you are. I'm glad to see you.
Farmington, Connecticut.
Uh-huh.
Mount Dora, Florida.
Terrific.
Indianapolis, Indiana.
Okay. I lost track of all of these. I was trying to remember them, but yes. All right. Terrific.
New York.
New York. Yes, sir.
Lubbock, Texas, home of Buddy Holly and Bobby Knight.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A Red Raider is with us. Yes, sir.
I'm from Baton Rouge, also known as LSU, Louisiana.
Yes, it is.
Atlanta, Georgia. Nashville, and I work at Vanderbilt. My son's graduating from Peabody.
Terrific. Congratulations. And I think that's all of us. I'm Michael McLendon. I'm a professor of public policy and higher education and the Associate Dean and Chief of Staff at Peabody College. And what a great pleasure and a privilege this is for me to be with you at a time of real celebration for you. Celebration upon the graduation of a child, in many instances. Celebration upon your liberation from paying one more year of Vanderbilt tuition. I tell my students and my colleagues that I have one of the great jobs in all the world. I'm actually paid to teach, to study, and to write about higher education. So I love universities, and when my provost called me some months ago and said, Michael, will you deliver one of these study break commencement week lectures, faculty lectures, I enthusiastically agreed, and it was clear that the topic should be on something related to higher education. And my provost asked, not an easy task, he said, would you also talk about something related to funding of higher education? And what a more dynamic, interesting time there could be to discuss and to talk about higher education in the United States. What I'd like to do is to focus on one specific aspect of higher education and funding, and that is how funding for higher education has changed so very much. Not just in the past couple of years, actually, but over the course of several decades. And at the end of this, to consider some of the things that I think universities need to think more about as they think about how to become more financially resilient, to weather not only the short-term economic calamity that's upon us, but to think about increasing quality and accessibility and affordability throughout the entire higher education enterprise. Before we get there, join me, if you would, in thinking about the university of about 130 years ago. Let's go back in time. At that time, Vanderbilt would have been less than a decade old, and this college that we would see would be quite different than what we envision today. We probably would hardly recognize it. We visualize that college of the late 19th century as sitting inevitably upon a lush hillside, and in fact, many of them were so located. The college at that time would have been small, indeed probably in many cases no more than a handful of faculty and a couple of dozen students. They would have been largely or entirely male. They were denominational, hence private. They were rooted to the classical curriculum, so students studied exclusively grammar and logic and rhetoric and mathematics, perhaps astronomy in some instances, and particularly important for our discussion today, they would have been almost entirely, all of them, of poor stature and poor resources. That is to say that most colleges only 120 or 130 years ago were impoverished. In fact, well into the 1880s, few students paid any tuition because a college could not because students had the college education had very little value in the labor market, and colleges had to do one of two things. They could, as Frederick Rudolph, the great higher education historian, reminds us, they could stay in business only either if they failed to pay faculty or if they paid students to attend. And in order to stay in business, they paid faculty almost nothing in order to subsidize very deeply the cost of college attendance for students. Clearly, much has changed over this period. Higher education has moved from being a rather removed, elite institution with a curriculum so rigidly inflexible that no right-thinking young man would actually spend his own money to attend, to become an institution nestled at the very heart of American culture and commerce. As an industry, higher education today powers our nation's economy, catalyzes our global leadership in scientific discovery, and despite what some critics allege, occasionally produces graduates who are prepared for civic engagement and for an ever more competitive labor market. Because of its indispensability to our economy and to our democracy, the modern college has changed a great deal too. There are now more than 4,000 of them on the American landscape. They inhabit every conceivable locale, suburban, urban, and rural. They serve every level of student academic preparedness, from college prep to remedial, and they serve every conceivable clientele and community. Many of today's colleges, just as they were 120 or 130 years ago, are small, but some have grown immense. Indeed, nearly 200 universities boast enrollments of more than 20,000 students, and 7 each enroll more than 50,000 students. Beyond mission and scope and size, the financial profile of universities also has changed dramatically, particularly in the past few decades. For example, with more than 3,400 faculty and more than 18,900 staff, Vanderbilt University's operating budget in fiscal year 2008 was close to $3 billion, and we're not really a very large university. I sit today on the search committee to find the next chief financial officer for Vanderbilt University, and the complexity of financial management of large, wealthy universities is really remarkable. Vanderbilt attracts more than $500 million a year from the federal government for academic science. Johns Hopkins brings in more than $1.4 billion a year, and there are 7 universities approaching the $1 billion mark. And of course, there is that awkward matter of prices. Vanderbilt's sticker price in 2008 was roughly $36,000. You all perhaps very aware of that. Yet in the same year, did you know that 66 universities in this nation, 66 charged tuition in excess of Vanderbilt's, and 101 charged more than $32,000 a year? Remarkably, the public flagship universities, the ones that Americans still think of as being relatively low cost to attend, perhaps even free in many cases, they've seen remarkably steep tuition increases over the past 20 years. The most prestigious ones, the universities of Virginia and Michigan and Berkeley, are a long, long way removed from being cheap to attend. In brief, not only has the size and the complexity, the composition of colleges and universities in the United States undergone remarkable transformation, but the context of funding higher education has changed a great deal in recent years. And in addition to that, colleges and universities today confront perilous financial challenges. Before we talk about some of those challenges and how universities are responding, let me ask you to come back with me again, if you would, at this time to the 1960s and 1970s, that time that we fondly think of in higher education as our golden era, the golden age of American higher education. A period when institutions fully matured into the forms that we see them today. And our collective imagination about the nature of the modern college and university became fixed. Alexander Hurd, Vanderbilt University's distinguished chancellor for 20 years, made the following declaration in his first university address, his very first public address on April 28, 1963, just days after stepping foot as chancellor onto the Vanderbilt campus. He wrote, quote, "The broad and inherent obligations of modern, complex universities in the United States are known to most of us. In these institutions, we inquire into the nature of man and his environment. We transmit to others a portion of what is known and believed to be dear or believed to be useful. We train in the application of knowledge. We seek to stir and develop human minds and even to touch human hearts. Altogether, the modern American University as an institution is the central thinking organ in American society, and as such is laden with responsibilities both grave and precious. So let's think about this for just a moment. Inquire, transmit, train, stir minds, touch hearts. These are bold aspirational statements as to the university's core purpose, widely shared at that time by much of American society, and consequently, with enrollments bursting institutional seams and billions of dollars beginning to pour in from the federal government for research and academic science, colleges and universities in that period began endeavoring to uphold those, quote, responsibilities, both grave and precious. They became part of a larger national imperative to alternately power the nation's post-war economy, enhance social mobility, place man on the moon, end poverty, and prevent proverbial dominoes from falling in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. We would accomplish some of these charges better than we would others, but the period was one of expanding complexity and size and resource capacity, as well as increasing demands being placed upon our universities. We had at that time two distinct post-secondary higher education sectors, one public, one private. Funding of the private sector was tuition-driven, but with student subsidies deriving heavily from the federal and state government. Public higher education, as you know, operated on a very different funding model. Tuition at most flagship universities was nominal. Rather, the vast bulk of revenues derived from state and local tax appropriations. A redistribution of wealth, providing deep subsidies for students attending public campuses. The role of the public comprehensive college was to be open to the public, of sufficient quality, and virtually free to the student. The public research university was to sustain and implement the nation's research and development infrastructure, to be of generally high quality, but again, to be virtually free to the student. These assumptions began changing wildly. These assumptions about funding higher education began changing wildly in the 1980s for a complex set of reasons involving politics and economics and the higher education industry itself. Funding shifted for higher education in profound ways. Beginning in the late 1970s, we saw state funding of higher education decline. It declined in two respects. State funding of higher education declined relative to our nation's wealth. That is to say that as our wealth as a nation grew, government support of higher education failed to keep up. And even more important, perhaps, there was a funding decline relative to the number of students attending higher education. For example, while the amount of state funding for higher education rose from 1981 to 2008, the numbers of college students also vastly increased, out of proportion to the funding increases, meaning that institutions had far fewer dollars to spend on each student at the end of that period than at the beginning. Consequently, as compared with 1991, public colleges and universities in 2008 had about 8% fewer dollars to educate every student. This against the backdrop of remarkable inflation, or inflation that we've all read about, inflation in the core costs associated with keeping colleges and universities in business, energy costs, and escalating information technology costs, and health insurance costs. As you can imagine, declining government subsidies led to dramatic increases in tuition levels in the public sector. In this first graph, we see average tuition and fees at public flagship universities over the past 35 years. The blue bar represents tuition prices for in-state students, the red bar that of tuition for out-of-state students. And for both lines, it's a scary, steep, but now familiar upward trend. Overall, from 1978 to 2008, tuition in public colleges and universities rose by 186% in CPI-adjusted dollars. But something also very interesting happened in this period, as you can tell by the difference in the steepness of these two lines. Many selected public universities realized they had a brand, and they began charging out-of-state students much higher tuition levels than in-state students. And one can see just how marked this gap became and has become over time. Because of this, and for other reasons that I'll mention in just a few moments, private colleges and universities also witnessed steep tuition increases. This next figure, and it just goes up and up, this next figure shows average private sector tuition and fees over that same 35-year period, an increase of about 154% in inflation-adjusted dollars. Looking at these two trends in tandem, one can see average tuition for four-year colleges and universities. The red line for public institutions, the blue line for private institutions. Overall, of course, we see the familiar trend in both sectors. Vast increases, inflationary increases in tuition over this period of time. At about that same time, at the time in which we have escalating tuition in both public and private, the federal government's funding of Pell Grants. You'll recall that Pell Grants, created about 40 years ago, the financial aid program that benefits low-income students. The value of each Pell Grant awarded began to stagnate. Congress's funding of the Pell program couldn't keep up with the number of eligible students or with the tuition increases that we saw in both the public and private sectors. The grant has lost much of its purchasing power over the last 30 years, and today the Pell Grant covers merely 40% of the cost of attendance of an average public institution, average public four-year institution, and less than 15% of the cost of attendance at a private four-year college or universities. Now, these numbers, while interesting, mean relatively little aside from the question of affordability. That is to say, how have the college tuition levels risen relative to changes in family incomes of Americans? What can Americans actually afford to pay? And how has that changed over time? Well, it just so happens I have one more graph, and these are thin lines, obviously, but I hope that you can make out these different colors. This next graph shows the portion of a family's income required to pay tuition at an average priced public college by income quintile levels. So we have each of these quintiles, we have 5 different lines. Look right here in the middle. Look at the middle line, if you would, the yellow line, which represents what portion of annual family income a middle earning family would pay to attend tuition at a public four-year college. As late as the early 1980s, it would have taken only 5% of that middle earning income family's income to pay tuition, although today that has grown to about 15%. For the lowest earners, the change is more dramatic, climbing from about 10% to 30% over that period in time. That's on the public side. Now let's think just for a moment about the private side. We see even more pronounced trends when it comes to declines in affordability of private higher education over this same period of time. Look at this yellow line again. Here we have private institutions. Look at this yellow line, if you would, indicating that in the early 1980s, it would have taken about 20% of a middle income family's income to pay tuition at an average priced private college. In 2007, that figure had risen to more than 45%. For low-income earners, those in the bottom quintile, the burden is even heavier. It's climbed from about 50% of their income 25 years ago to about 120% today. So while college has become less affordable for everyone over that period in time, it's particularly so for low-income families, where it has been a catastrophic impact. In part because the realization by policymakers that tuition would continue to exceed the government's ability to subsidize it. And we've seen, as a result of that, the advent over the past 20 years of a series of innovative, market-oriented financing policies that, in effect, have shifted the burden of paying for college away from government and more directly to students and their families. And this has been one of the most dramatic and consequential developments in the history of all American higher education. For example, consider the 529 programs, prepaid tuition programs and college savings programs, ones that provide tax advantages to families to save for college. And how many of you have a 529 program? Have any of you contributed to a 529 program? A number of you. In 1988, only 3 states in the nation had either program. 20 years later, all 50 states have such a program. And consider the vast wealth that's accumulated in these programs over time. Only a decade ago, fewer than 1 million Americans had an account. Fewer than 1 million Americans had an account, and the average account size was about $6,000. In 2008, more than 11 million Americans had a 529 college savings plan, and the average size of each account was about $12,000. This next graph shows the total asset value of the money that now exists, or existed 6 months ago, in these 529 tax advantage programs, these prepaid tuition and college savings programs. The total asset value has grown dramatically. In just a decade, it's swelled from about $5 billion to more than $125 billion. Now, this is remarkable. Think back again to the paradigm of the 1960s and 1970s. The idea that families would have to be preparing financially to send their child to any public institution was largely unheard of. Today, it's assumed that, in fact, the government will not be subsidizing your child to the extent that it did 20 or 30 years ago, and families need to save earlier and save more for college education. Viewed together, these trends, declining state support, steepening tuition charges, stagnant government subsidies of student financial aid, and growing reliance by families on equity markets to fund their children's education, these trends are historic. By the 1990s, we clearly had entered into a new uncharted era of funding higher education in the United States. A new context in which markets, competition, and revenue diversification are more influential than ever before in our history. So, what has been driving these costs? Well, this is a controversial topic. There are a number of different explanations, and a number of different answers, but almost everyone agrees that universities and colleges have been facing a series of chronic, systemic challenges that have been driving up prices over the past several decades. For example, higher education is a labor-intensive industry, and that's made higher education vulnerable to certain inflationary pressures. For example, rising costs for health care and benefits. Second, aging faculty. And third, the end of mandatory retirement. So not only are faculty getting older, we can no longer make them retire as we could 20 years ago. So there's no mandatory retirement age. Our faculty are growing older, and at the very time in which we have more faculty, older faculty, and unable to retire them in many instances, the benefits associated with their health care costs have been escalating, of course, as health care inflation has been right throughout our system. I mentioned health care costs, and as you know, health insurance expenses are the fastest growing component for employers. These expenses have hit universities particularly hard. While average faculty salaries have grown by about 16% over the last 30 years, average benefit expenditures per full-time faculty member have grown by 75%. So where universities are so constrained financially in terms of labor costs is not necessarily the faculty salaries. It's not their salaries, which in fact have not risen much over time. It's the benefits associated with having these faculty with us. For public higher education, it's even more complex. Colleges and universities have been slammed by dramatic growth in state Medicaid spending. You know, only about a decade ago, the state spent $90 billion a year on Medicaid obligations. Today, or last year, they spent about $200 billion. Most of that increase, those state obligations to meet federal mandates under the Medicaid program, much of that money has been siphoned away from the last remaining discretionary item in state budgets. That item, higher education. Second, higher education is also a capital-intensive industry. So I mentioned that we're labor-intensive, but we're also capital-intensive. There are costs associated with growing numbers of IT support staff, the cost of providing and updating computers, software licenses, networking, and the ever-growing demand for advanced technology in research. Between 2002 and 2006, this 5 or 6 year period, average IT spending per student rose from $1,400 to almost $3,000. So that's a dramatic increase in the tens of billions of dollars that universities are now spending on capital in the form of information technology, just in particular. But there's also been, and this is where it becomes a little bit more complex and controversial, there's also been, over the past decade or two, a higher education arms race. A higher education arms race. There are costs associated with intense competition and prestige seeking throughout U.S. higher education. Our universities compete more and more for very talented students. And in order to attract those students and to keep up with our competitors, colleges and universities have undertaken expensive capital construction projects and all kinds of other endeavors aimed at attracting students and faculty to our campuses. There are several components to this arms race. There is a market for faculty quality. Universities like Vanderbilt and others are in a very keen competition to attract star faculty. Those star faculty may have high salaries, but that's not really the most important component of the cost. The cost is often in laboratories and new buildings that are required to host them and their staffs and their assistants. So we have office space and the associated energy costs associated with maintaining these faculty and their laboratories. The physical plants that have grown over time. Recruitment of star faculty, as I mentioned, changing student demands. So the expectation among many students who are consumers in this marketplace for higher education goods and services, looking for the campus, of course, where they will learn a great deal, but also that feels right, that feels good, that looks good, that's pretty, and that has lots of amenities. And so universities have been building lots and lots of buildings over time, lots of construction projects, including new dormitories. This isn't helpful. Student life centers, athletic facilities, the very things that we've been doing at Vanderbilt, in part because we believe we ought to do them for our students and they're meaningful and they have educational value, but also because all of our competitors are doing that as well. Regulation, federal regulation and state regulation of higher education has grown over time, and there are costs associated with regulation, just as there are costs associated with the rankings. This U.S. News and World Report rankings that drive so much of what higher education, particularly elite private and public institutions, do. This notion that one needs to stay up with one's peers that also has driven up costs over time. Consequently, many colleges and universities, not unlike consumers, have been on a spending binge. They borrowed lots of debt to finance expensive projects in the belief that there would always be more well-paying students. And then, unforeseen, dramatic, historic, came the meltdown in the equity and credit markets of 2008. Asset price collapses and financial catastrophe stemming from years of credit growth, excessive leverage, and bubbles in property prices. And against this backdrop, many of our wealthiest universities suffered vast historic losses in the values of their endowments. We've read about this on the front page of the New York Times and others places over the last few months. Harvard University's endowment loss could approach $8 billion. $8 billion that Harvard has lost. The University of Virginia is nearly $1 billion. Grinnell College, $1.2 billion. Amherst College, $1.7 billion. These are historic declines in a vital operating stream, revenue stream for universities. And this decline, this crash in revenues associated with endowments, coupled with the implosion of the credit markets and in some cases the requirement by some universities to meet margin calls, led to a perfect storm in the fall of 2008. Some of our wealthiest universities, those with endowments in the billions of dollars, barely met payroll, and some couldn't meet payroll. Over the past several months, as the most acute phase of this crisis has dissipated, virtually every institution everywhere began considering additional needed responses to this crisis. And let me share just a few of these with you. For example, Princeton University announced it would be making $170 million in budget cuts. Harvard has offered 1,600 buyouts. Stanford announced in January it would cut its budget by 15%, or about $100 million in 2 years, and then less than 2 months later they came back and said, no, we've got to do it in 1 year. The crisis is just that severe. 450 layoffs announced at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Freezes at Johns Hopkins. Duke University mulling early retirements, and Cornell announced a $60 million budget cut for 2010. Voluntary retirement and an effort to raise almost $1 billion in taxable bonds. One recent survey, in fact, showed that almost 1/3 of the 600 private colleges that had been surveyed indicate they may not have enough capital to weather a long recession, and some might be forced to close. What about on the public side? University of California, Berkeley, one of those great flagship institutions, public flagship universities in the country, has announced restricting hiring of new faculty. University of Florida officials announced a plan that would save about $108 million by cutting 400 faculty and staff positions. Florida and California, but Florida in particular, a state that with which I'm well familiar, has suffered so much in terms of its public higher education system. So many cuts. It's difficult to know how they will find fiscal health and how they're going to rebuild some of these losses moving forward. They're really very, very deep. Florida State announcing it'll close 21 degree programs, and these are just a few examples. Hundreds of colleges, public colleges and universities throughout the nation instituting really historic cuts. Even at Vanderbilt, we've felt the effects. Discretionary spending has been reduced. There's been a general hiring freeze on staff. Searches for tenure track and tenured faculty during the 2009 academic year are focused only on extraordinary hires. Our provost used the term some time ago, they needed to be eye-popping hires. Eye-popping is, for any university, but particularly for Vanderbilt, an awfully high threshold. So obviously we have not hired a great deal new faculty, many new faculty this year. And many areas throughout the university have been asked to reduce expenses by 5% for the coming year. But here's the good news. As of February 2009, the Vanderbilt endowment was down only 16%, the second best in the country, compared to an average of 24% nationally. Student applications are at historic high levels, and no major layoffs have been announced or are projected. At this rather somber and some might say depressing moment in my presentation, you'll recall that the title of this talk had something to do with new opportunities. And, well, what are those? New opportunities in funding higher education. While traumatic in the short run, I would maintain that this adversity may hold seeds for long-term improvement in our entire higher education enterprise. And I'd like to focus on 6 in particular. First, colleges and universities should continue assessing the need for strategic reductions and realignments of programs. Now, this seems like the obvious thing that universities would do, and yet we don't probably see it frequently enough. Even before the recent financial crisis, many colleges and universities had worked hard to identify new funding approaches. One approach focuses on the cost structure of institutions. The other approach on its resource flows. First, let me say a word about cost structure. Painful budget choices are not new to higher education and not as rare as is popularly believed. For example, many institutions over the past decade have sought to externalize faculty employment by moving from full-time tenure-line faculty, that is the kind that your children and family members would have encountered here at Vanderbilt in the main, to part-time faculty, ones who are generally available at much lower cost per course. And this kind of effort, externalizing faculty employment, can lead to cost savings in the near term, for sure. But the limited stability of part-timers also creates trade-offs. Trade-offs in the form of diminished student advising, curricular coherence, and as some recent evidence shows, lower graduation rates and student engagement. There probably is not a great deal more that universities will be willing to do in the form of externalizing faculty. We may be limited there. A second response involves resource flows. How do we get more revenues in the institution? Many colleges have sought cost savings in the face of burgeoning demand by making offerings accessible to new groups of students. More summer classes, more weekend classes, more night classes, better utilization of existing facilities to increase access for new student groups. However, many of our universities will probably reach the upper end of this soon. And going back to the Florida example, of course, there are now enrollment caps at many Florida institutions because there's so much demand for higher education in Florida and California and other states. In those places, particularly in the American Southwest, there's just not a lot more room to put more students. So institutions are limited there. Of course, we've long heard about the advantages of instructional technology. That has long promised radical savings in costs associated with teaching and learning. In theory, technologies could be used to educate students at lower faculty cost per student, but IT often has not worked this way because, as I mentioned earlier, there is equipment and there is staffing and there's faculty training, all of which are expensive, and plus there is that human element. Students need real live human beings, and as a faculty member I can attest that we need live students as well. So what do we cut? What do universities cut? The Virginia Tech experience, the trauma of the Virginia Tech experience, that catastrophe has reinforced the vital importance of mental health services. Surely we wouldn't cut those. Would we cut career centers at a time of tightening labor markets and increasing competition for jobs? Probably not. In Florida and California, we've seen the disastrous consequences of position freezes and stagnant salaries for faculty for so long now that faculty are leaving those states for positions in other states. We have a intellectual and human capital brain drain from Florida and California to other states, and out-migration because of stagnant faculty salaries in those states and elsewhere. I would argue that rather than these, what we ought to be focused on, and I think what universities are thinking more about these days, is taking considered looks at programs, a considered look at programs, weaker academic programs, ones of less centrality to the institution's mission, or ones with less demonstrated impact on society should be re-examined. Our tendency too often in the past has been to cut across the board, to spread the retrenchment pain. Too infrequently have universities and colleges, or for that matter, state systems of higher education, been willing to make hard decisions about program performance. The politics of universities and sometimes the failure of leadership have prevented universities, in many instances, from making hard-minded decisions that would better align their academic operation with their values and their strategic goals. There are hard choices to be made, and they will vary by sector and by circumstance, but financial crisis sometimes provides that needed cover for universities to make tough decisions about its core. And many universities are now realizing this more so than even a year ago. Second, our universities and colleges must strive toward greater distinctiveness. Paraphrasing Clark Kerr, many of our institutions have evolved from the university to the multiversity to something even more fragmented today. Many of them try to do everything, and perhaps in many cases everything is too much. Growing numbers of institutions see this moment as one in which to re-examine their core strategies. Developing a strategy, of course, has something to do with deciding what you'll offer and for whom, but it also requires making tough decisions about what you'll not do, who you are not, who you will not serve. And if we're going to successfully protect the heart, the core of our universities, and plan for the future, then we need to make tough decisions about how we invest, how we make focused investments of time, money, and human capital. Mission creep has been one of the central cost factors in higher education over the past quarter century, contributing to inefficiencies, program duplication, and ultimately more costs to students. Instead, institutions must strive harder toward that focused strategy I just mentioned, choosing from myriad different competing opportunities. Not all of us need to blindly copy the research university model, and why would we want that? Historically, our system, this American system, has been the most diverse system of higher education in the world, and it served us well for many, many years. As a system, we need to re-embrace the value of institutional distinctiveness as we look toward an ever more competitive and fiscally constrained future. Open access institutions need to be rewarded for serving vast numbers of low-income and first-generation college students. They should resist the temptations of selectivity, for while often serves the parochial interest of faculty and ambitious administrators, it disserves our local communities and our nation's capacity to produce needed human capital. Our distinctive teaching institutions should take great pride in and be rewarded for their high calling to the scholarship of teaching, as the late Ernie Boyer termed it, to the shaping of minds through intense, direct contact between faculty and student. And our pure research universities should never apologize for providing the nation's backbone of basic and applied research and for their role in economic development. My point is this: institutions should pursue their own distinctive futures, less compelled than in the past to mimic highly ranked research universities. I very much like this notion of best in class, right? That legislatures and agencies that monitor the performance of public institutions to the boards that oversee the private ones. We need to return to making resource allocations and judgments about performance consistent with our institutional mission. Once institutions do so, they can better align their investments with their strategic purposes, which I submit is key to long-term financial prosperity. Number 3, our institutions need to grow more comfortable with more rigorous assessments of student development. Competition among highly selective universities for top students has been growing for a long time. For many universities, competition with other players in the knowledge industry, for example, for-profit institutions, is also growing. The day is coming when our universities may have to outcompete one another, not on the dimension of high GRE scoring students or on luxury services provided, that is input measures, but rather on demonstrated learning gains. How has the institution contributed towards student growth, intellectual growth, social growth, cognitive growth, civic growth? Too few institutions have taken these questions as seriously as they should because the questions are not easy. They're something for which institutions have not been rewarded historically, and frankly, we might not want to know the answer. But mounting pressure from accreditors, from government, and from consumers, from our families and our students, are driving campuses to use assessments in ways that demonstrably improve student outcomes. In the future, those colleges and universities that are able to demonstrate what their students have learned will be better positioned to align resources with instructional mission, make cost-effective investments in programs and people, more effectively market, and be better able to defend tuition and pricing decisions. 4th, institutions should consider innovative degree and pricing strategies. Now, for example, the third-year baccalaureate. Many of you may be familiar with that. This is nothing new. Institutions in the state of New York were experimenting with this in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But more institutions are considering it in an effort to realize efficiencies, market themselves better, save costs, and move students to the labor market more quickly. There may be concerns. Clearly there may be concerns about what students may be losing when we have them complete college in 3 years as opposed to 4. But for those institutions facing dire economic straits, and for those students who may not attend if they can't get through faster, this may make sense. And here at Vanderbilt, as well as many other highly selective institutions, we have been experimenting in recent years with 5-year degree programs, efforts to move students through 4 years of undergraduate and a master's in a year or even less. So the point here is that overall, students may want to move faster, and institutions need to help think about how to facilitate that. Many public universities have shifted to revenue diversification, relying less on state funding and more on private gifts and tuition. But there is also the question for all institutions of tuition differentiation. Tuition has long been differentiated by residency status, as we saw on that slide a few moments ago, for those students attending public institutions. But now finer distinctions have emerged. Some campuses vary tuition by the offering unit, by the institutional cost or the instructional cost associated with a particular course, by the student's field of major, or by the timing of the course. The online education markets and the distance education markets are prime grounds for such experimentation in tuition and fees. The challenge here lies in how do we protect the core? How do we protect the humanities and the liberal arts, where there often is less demand than in the professions, with differentiation strategies that incentivize the right student course-taking behavior? 5th, families should begin preparing earlier and more aggressively for children's education, and colleges and universities need to do more to help. Not only do families no longer have the government to rely upon for financing their children's education as they may have thought they did 40 years ago and 30 years ago, but now they may question whether the equity markets are as reliable as they once had been. Those 529 plans that I mentioned earlier, which had grown to their assets to $125 billion as of 2008, well, they've lost a quarter of that value in the last 9 months. Absent universities holding the line on tuition, there are a few good answers for this predicament. But families need to begin saving for college earlier and more aggressively, and the government will have to do more as well. It needs to do more in helping low-income Americans understand how to save for college and how to do it effectively. This lack of information by low-income and middle-income families with respect to preparing financially for college is one of the major barriers to college attendance today. Colleges and universities have a major role to play as well in the college affordability agenda. As families do more, universities must do more beyond cost cutting. They'll need to cut spending in order to hold the line on tuition, yes, but in the long run, maybe endowment payouts need to be raised so that institutions can provide more institutional financial aid for needy students and middle-income students. Between 2001 and 2007, the amount of grant aid that institutions awarded to students grew by 34% at private four-year institutions and 43% at public four-year institutions. So institutions are trying harder to use their own assets in ways to subsidize the cost of attendance for many students, particularly poorer ones. In 2008, Vanderbilt joined a small number of universities that have eliminated need-based loans from financial aid packages offered to eligible undergraduates. Starting this fall, the amount of need-based loans normally included in undergraduate financial aid awards for students will be replaced with Vanderbilt grants and scholarships. So institutions are moving in this path of trying hard, working hard to use their assets in ways, their wealth, in ways that really advantage students and encourage attendance. And yet they can do more, I think. And sixth, finally, our colleges and universities should be better prepared for value investors. Some keen observers recently have predicted a trend in value investing in higher education, something analogous to that investor practice of buying stocks in companies that are trading below their intrinsic value. More and more families are looking for a great value in higher education. They're looking beyond reputational indicators, looking beyond those indicators to quality institutions that offer a great experience and a great value at a great price. There's growing pressure on colleges and universities to get their value propositions in order. On the financial landscape of higher education, the savvy institutions and the successful ones will be those able to answer cogently the question, what's the unique value of an experience or a degree at this institution, and is it worth the price? Answering this question presumes that an institution has probably done some of the preceding 5 things. They've made tough program choices. They've strived towards mission differentiation and institutional distinctiveness. They've assessed the value the institution has added to student growth and development. They've considered new ways of educating and graduating students, and they've helped families better subsidize the growing costs of their child attending their institution. In closing, let me share with you a comment from the eminent education sociologist Burton Clark. Bob wrote many years ago, the cherished academic view that higher education started out on the Acropolis and was desecrated by descent into the Agora, the marketplace, led by ungodly commercial interests and scheming public officials and venal academic leaders, is just not true. If anything, higher education started in the Agora, at the bottom of the hill, and ascended to the Acropolis at the top of the hill. Mostly it has lived in tension throughout its history, at one time and at the bottom of the hill, at the top of the hill, and on pathways in between. Unquestionably, ours is a time at which colleges and universities struggle mightily with this tension between academic norms and the marketplace. If they're to thrive, and therefore American culture and commerce are to thrive in the difficult days ahead, it will be in part because our institutions, our colleges and universities, our lights of learning, will have found ways to effectively balance and creatively balance academic norms with shifting market forces. Many of the established ways of doing business have crumbled, and our institutions will have to change to meet those challenges. I thank you, and hopefully we have a few minutes left for any comments or questions.